Well, welcome once again, everybody. Yinka, thank you so much for inviting me to be your interrogator this evening. I'm a great admirer of your work in a whole range of media: photography, sculpture, material culture, sound, and of course, latterly film. I thought we might begin. I know you've got a large number of slides. Perhaps we ought to begin with talking a little bit about some of your best-known work. I think the early slides really sum that up for people who are not familiar with how your project has developed over time. I think from my perspective, let me say that it's terribly important to try and place that work in some of its larger historical frames. I think culturally, nationally, and generationally too. It seems to me that your peers, Sonia Boyce, notable academic and painter now, Keith Piper, Isaac Julian, another, both recently elevated by the Royal Academy. I suppose I think of your work as in dialogue and connected to the larger life of that movement, but I've always thought there was another note being sounded there, a different engagement with the absurdity of national history in its colonial and racial iterations more broadly. And I wonder how much that's connected really to your to the result of your life in Lagos prior to your return here at the age of 17, so that you begin to see things here differently, culturally, from a different and distinctive angle. Also, I think perhaps inspired by and negotiated against the provocations of the US Black Arts movement. You mentioned when we spoke the importance of David Hammons in realizing your own thinking. So can we begin with the double Dutch of so long ago now, if you can bear to cast your mind back that far and talk about what this project meant to you in terms of the problem of authenticity, the discoveries you made in Brixton Market, the unexpected provenance of a travelling culture which assumed some configurations that you hadn't anticipated and nobody else had thought about at all.
Yes. Well, I think to begin, I must start with context, and I should start with my family background, where I grew up, and how I ended up doing the kind of work that I do. Now, my father was a very strict Nigerian lawyer who didn't want me to do art. I wanted me to go into law, and but I'd also say that my career in art actually began, believe it or not, as a result of the bad traffic in Lagos. Now, I will go further to explain that. We had a driver that used to pick us up at school, and the traffic was really bad. It used to be really late. So I ended up waiting in the art room to do my art. But then I soon realized that this could be a tool of rebellion against my Victorian father. My father was very conservative, and my father absolutely loved the royal family. So it was of that old kind of colonial. My father was taught by the kind of colonial administrators in Nigeria. So he was a real Anglophile, and so that's the background. That's the context. I came to the UK to school, and then subsequently I went to art school. Now, I grew up in a household where my father had his, Time magazine, National Geographic, and I didn't quite understand what black was actually, because in the context of Nigeria, we didn't have racial distinctions. So when I came to Britain, I was at art school, and one of my I became rather, well, in my first year, I was, drawing the nude and life drawing, and I was at Barhamshire School of Art. I couldn't quite understand why I had to do all this life drawing. So in my second year, I became rather politicized, and I was encountering, feminist politics and post-colonial politics. So I rebelled, and but I wanted to place my work in the context of kind of global discourse and global politics. So I was making work about actually perestroika that was happening in the then Soviet Union. And then one of my tutors saw my work and he said, you are of African origin, aren't you? Yes, of course. Why are you making work about perestroika? And I thought, well, you know, I mean, I can be part of a global conversation, can't I? And he said, no, I mean, why aren't you making authentic African art? So then, well, as somebody who grew up in Nigeria, yes, you know, knew a bit about some traditional things, but Lagos is rather distant from that. And I grew up watching Sesame Street on TV, and Skippy and all of those things. And then to come to London to be told that you can't be part of a global conversation. So I then, in search of this notion of authenticity, I went to, well, first, actually, I think at first I went to the Museum of Mankind in search of my authenticity.
Did you find it there?
I didn't, no. So I then went to Brixton Market.
Did you find it there?
I found something there.
Good.
So this is what we will now come to. So I found the African textiles. Now, I grew up imagining that the textiles were authentically African. Then to find out that actually the textiles are Indonesian-influenced fabrics produced by the Dutch, and then they tried to sell those fabrics in Indonesia, but the industrially produced versions were not acceptable there, so they tried West Africa, and some soldiers also took the fabrics to West Africa. But the fabrics are now being made in Africa, in China, but I thought this was actually very interesting because I thought this fabric then is the ideal metaphor for this kind of global contemporary citizen. And also the idea, so at the same time I was encountering the works of French continental theory and postmodernism, and also I was reading, Frantz Fanon. And in the context of all of this, a lot of work was coming out of the United States. So there were people like, David Hammons, and then a lot of feminist art as well. Judy Chicago, Barbara Kruger, and Nancy Sparrow. So I was also, so identity politics then was becoming quite central. But most interestingly, when I came across the work of Jacques Derrida and Roland Barthes, so the notion of, deconstruction and deconstructing the canons. Now, so American universities and also British institutions were actually starting to challenge the Western canon as a whole, and this was across the board in various disciplines. Yep. And so, of course, I was a keen student, and I, read as much as I could. I didn't understand a word of what I was reading, by the way. So the question then, how do you make a non-Western contemporary art? Or how do you challenge the Western canon? And how do you parody that as well? Because I've always been, and I'm very interested, I have a love-hate relationship with the establishment. So I'm very interested in the establishment. I want to be part of the establishment, but I also want to destroy the establishment. So there's a kind of, there's a sort of inner contradiction. Now, to get back to what you were saying about the Black Art movement, I felt that I didn't want to be a hypocrite because of my background. Quite honestly, I can't say that I have a lot to be angry about in terms of, I didn't want to, I wanted to ridicule this, if there's such a thing as the system, and to parody and to mimic. And the notion of disguise, masquerade, carnival, all those things were kind of fundamental to what I would then go on to do.
Well, I want to go back to the cloth, because
Yes.
it seems to me that discovery, that important discovery that you made in Brixton Market, and which
Yes.
you began to use
Yes.
in your restaging
Yes.
of certain artistic and historical problems which are fundamental
Yes.
to the cultural life of our country,
Yes.
that cloth has stayed with you. You've kept it. You haven't, as you've moved through different media, you haven't abandoned it. So there must be something very important about the way the cloth itself works that you wanted to go on developing, pushing further and further as you have developed your projects across media and across time.
Well, see, there was a dilemma that a number of my contemporaries, there was a dilemma we talked about quite a lot. Now, the dilemma was, okay, as a woman, do you make work about being a woman? Do you make feminine art? Is there such a thing as women's work? Now, as an artist of African origin, do you make work about your African origin, or do you make Western art? Now, the questions, it occurred to me that if you made work about being black, you would be the black artist who makes work about being black. But if you didn't make work about being black, you would be the black artist who doesn't make work about being black. Yeah. So I thought actually, so that then the image or the stereotype is actually kind of fundamental. So then the question is, how does one take that on and then start to somehow deconstruct that?
Yes.
And so you have to remember that when I started, this was in the 80s. Yeah. Actually, there were no really prominent black artists at that time. Jean-Michel Basquiat came along, yes. Later on. And so finding a role model or finding a way to actually work, was quite difficult. So I had to actually reinvent a language that I thought was contextually sincere.
Yeah. Well, of course, these days, the deconstructive appetite is much more comfortable with taking apart the world of gender than it is with taking apart the world that's made into, offered to us in the form of a racial hierarchy.
Yes.
People are still much more unsettled by the idea that is open to a similar kind of deconstruction. And it seems to me you've engaged these questions from, well, can I say this? In a playful way. There's something joyful, there's something humorous about the way that you have opened up these issues, which is was not always in tune with the different, perhaps more, dare I say this, more sociologically inclined work of some of the contemporaries who were more closely and loudly positioned within a black arts movement. There's something playful, there's something very important about that play.
I think I became an artist because I've always been a fan of art. I started, just thinking back to the works that I liked in the beginning. I liked Surrealism, and then, I liked the Impressionists. I've moved through. So, and I always loved materiality. And I feel that my art, although conceptual, it's also a form of poetry. Mm-hmm. And so that then to lose the lyrical, the whimsical in my work would be dishonest. I actually like the playful, but then, that said, I recognize the darkness beneath that. And so then, I don't want to hit, my audience, I want them to be comfortable, to be comfortable, but then hit them with a jab later. Right. But you've got to, I have to find a way of seducing them.
Yes.
And so aesthetics and materiality was a way into that. But of course, I must say that, yes, the work may be sometimes frivolous and playful. It's coming from a very serious place.
Yes, to call it playful was not a way of calling it frivolous in any sort of way. I don't think you're frivolous at all in what you do. And I've not seen any reading of your work which suggests that. So, although I suppose there might be a kind of tactical frivolity.
I do embrace frivolity.
Okay, good.